This will be an overview of Chapter 4 of the book by Daniel Chamovitz called What a Plant Knows. Chapter 4 is What a Plant Hears. So the question would be, are plants deaf to the noisy world, whether they're living in a natural environment or non-natural in someone's neighborhood? Or is it possible we just don't understand their responses to hearing things? It turns out there's a lot of anecdotal evidence, very few scientific studies. First of all, how humans hear. Our ability to hear depends on detecting vibrations with an organ like an ear, which are pressure waves traveling toward the ear and sensed by mechanoreceptors. And basically, these are hair cells in our inner ears. Through a fairly complex mechanism, they can detect volume and pitch, so how loud it is and what tone it is. And then they can communicate the stimulus via nerve transmissions to our brains for processing. And so this is essentially the same system that we've seen with other senses, whether it's touch or sight. Hearing is going to be much the same. So a history of studies of whether plants can hear is fairly speckled with bad science, distinctly different from the history of many other things that plants can do and sense. As far back as Charles Darwin was interested in whether his plants could hear, and he played the bassoon to his sensitive plants, to no effect and some disappointment apparently. These are the plants that will wilt rapidly when touched, but apparently not under the influence of bassoon playing. There was another study from some folks in Arizona who claimed they saw increased seed germination when healing energy and gentle music was directed at the seeds. This was not duplicated, and no rigorous science was backing it anyway. Then in 1964, a woman named Dorothy Ritelak was just taking a biology class and decided needed to do an experiment for it, and she was a classical musician and decided she would see the effect of music on her plants. And so she ended up writing a book of a range of extremely badly designed experiments where the plants received either classical music or 1960s rock music. And of singular importance is the fact that she was quite conservative and just absolutely hated rock and roll and was determined it was the root of all evil. And this definitely influenced her experimental design and conclusions. She particularly hated Hendrix and Led Zeppelin, and showed that even if you took out the music and only played the drum beats from those songs, that the plants were still stunted or even dead. And of course, from what we've seen with the effects of mechanical stress on plants, it could be that they were actually being shaken if she was playing music loud enough. But she claimed her classical music plants thrived. Extremely poor experimental design. There was usually less than 5 plants in a treatment. There were no replicates, so it was just treatment A and music and music A and music B. She used different plants with about every experiment. She didn't replicate one experiment to the next. And things like soil moisture were just judged by touching. So she it's possible the plants were not even being treated the same, let alone other issues with experimental design. In her book, she quoted all sorts of different experts. The important point that none of them were biologists. They were psychics and musicians. Her research has never been duplicated, even though it's been tried. And yet today she still comes back to haunt us, as we shall see. Additionally, there was in '65 somebody at a botanical garden had heard that claims that out of India that music would help marigolds become more bushy, would branch more. And this, of course, was in the same era where Dorothy Ritelak's book was still in popular culture. So these folks at the Botanical Garden introduced their plants to a range of music: Gregorian chants, Mozart, Dave Brubeck, Beatles, and they had actual scientific controls, which was distinct from Retallack, and concluded there were no effects on the plants. However, their conclusions were published in a scientific journal, and Dorothy's book was still getting major publicity from even through the 70s. And then, just to really top things off, the book Secret Life of Plants came out, and it had a chapter in it about a harmonic life of plants, and where they claimed that plants like Bach and Mozart, but they actually preferred Ravi Shankar. So, and this again, it was even worse experimental design than Dorothy Retallack. These were just general observations of a few plants, nothing even remotely close to rigorous experimentation. And at the time, an eminent plant physiologist, Galston, was quoted as saying, "The trouble with the secret life of plants is that it consists almost exclusively of bizarre claims presented without adequate supporting evidence." And that is true yet today. But then once again, the book got a lot of publicity and acceptance by the non-scientific public, and the scientists were not consulted or given a chance to even give their opinions. Since then, there's been a few other studies. A scientist was studying plant response to touch, checked to see if loud noise might affect the experimental results, and she chose the talking heads and found there was no result, no effect of plus or minus hearing the talking heads playing. Another scientist was studying music on effect on corn growth, and he chose to contrast Mozart and Meatloaf. And the initial observations were that there was actually an increase in germination with both music styles, which would have been somewhat tragic for lovers of either one. Almost definitely going to not love the other style. However, when they repeated the experiment with a fan keeping the air circulating thoroughly, they got no effect and with either style of music, and realized that the heat from the speakers playing for prolonged periods of time had warmed the seeds up, so they had seen an increase in germination. Deaf genes in plants. Interestingly enough, some of the genes that cause deafness in humans are found in plants. However, plants and humans actually share quite a few genes. Many code for basic cellular functions that would have been in place before plants and animals diverged in the evolutionary scheme of things. The fact that a gene that causes cystic fibrosis in humans, it isn't really a gene to cause cystic fibrosis. It causes something doesn't work right that then results in cystic fibrosis. So in that example, there's a gene that's actually responsible for ion transport. That is what causes the disease. So that very same gene could still be functioning in plants, and that is the case with the genes that, the deaf genes that we do find in plants. And for example, 4 of those code for proteins that are involved in little nanomotors that are involved in intracellular organelle movement, moving the results of Golgi bodies or different organelles around within the cell. And so sure enough, the mutation in one of those proteins causes deafness, because that particular one helps form the hair cells in the inner ear when they're developing, and mutations can lead to deafness in that. And then plants have the same thing, and sure enough, plants that have mutations in that gene have malformed root hairs. So similar function doesn't mean anything to do with hearing. Now we have some fresh claims in the last 10 years or so. Somebody working in vineyards in Italy has claimed that he has been playing music to the plants in the vineyard, and he gets better plant growth. He does also almost offhandedly say, and it also keeps the animals away, and so it's not too hard to imagine that the plants are growing better because they're less predation. You could imagine there would be less birds around, less insects around, and so it would have to be concluded that that's not a particularly rigorous scientific design. But nevertheless, all over the place you can find quotes saying, "Oh, well, now it's been shown that vineyards in Italy grow better when they're played music," and then they're digging back up Dorothy Retallack as if her stuff has been the baseline of reality for since the 60s. So when you're looking at scientific results, please look at the scientist and the design. Possibilities, though, there's always a chance that the right experiment hasn't been done. Perhaps when the other experiments where we've looked at plant physiological responses of plants to light and to touching and other different types of stimulus, perhaps the physiological response that occurred is easy to find in those other experiments, and it would not be so easy to detect in plants. And so, perhaps it's something not music. Maybe it's something natural, like insects buzzing, or sound of plants under water stress. There's popping occurs when the xylem starts collapsing. Perhaps other plants respond to that. And so what would a plant need to hear is probably the question needs to be asked, and that might help direct the correct experiment being designed. So conclusions, evolutionary biologist Theodosis Dobzhansky, I hope I pronounced that right, is quoted as saying, "Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." And so when you look at plants, why would they need to hear? It's very useful to animals. You can run away from danger. You can communicate quickly with other humans, other animals. You can communicate long distances. The response just about always, though, is movement. You're going to move away from or toward the response to your sound. And so maybe since plants can't relocate, they just don't need to hear. Never developed the ability. That concludes Chapter 4.